First item is a call to order, but before we begin, we acknowledge that we are gathered on the traditional and unceded territory of the Lummi, Nooksack, Samish, and Semiahmoo people who have cared for and tended this land since time immemorial. Truth and acknowledgement are critical to building mutual respect and connection across all barriers of heritage and difference. We begin this effort to acknowledge what has been buried by honoring the truth. We pay respect to their elders, past and present. Please take a moment to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us together here today. And please join us in uncovering such truths in any and all public events. And with that, I'll call the meeting to order. And we'll go with item number 1, which is task force agenda items.
I have the draft agenda for the task force meeting. Let me pull it up here if you'd like and share. All right, can you all see that? Yeah, okay. One question on item number 4. This is the update that Ann's been giving on behavioral health crisis response program. Ann is also scheduled to give this update to the joint meeting next week. And I think between presentations to council and the joint meeting, that covers just about everyone. And I'm wondering if, Ann, do we want to have the meeting or this update for the full task force and then take it off legal and justice? Or do you want to do both?
Well, I don't want to bore people with repetitive information. So I guess what is the best, what's your recommendation?
It's up to you guys.
Dan, what do you and Mike think?
I am never bored when Ann Deacon speaks.
No, yeah.
It's true. I
Well,
think
you need a life.
Well, okay, good point, Ann. Maybe I do need a life. As I was reviewing our the draft, it's also one of the big things for 2021 and kind of our next step. So I view it as important. That's just my thought.
So we have members on the behavioral health committee that are not task force members that would not be at the task force main meeting, and we have several new people, and we have another new person. So I think it's a benefit if, and I don't want to, put you on the spot here, but we'd really love it if you could come to behavioral health and present to those committee only members.
And so, so I have the joint meeting on my schedule for next Tuesday, the 11th. And are you saying besides that there are others, or that would work? That would cover most people then? That
would cover, assuming that those members attended that joint meeting, would be covered on that one. I was referring to that versus the broader task force.
All right.
Is that an and or an or? Do we think it's still valuable to present that to the full task force?
Oh yeah, I do.
Yeah. So, okay, that's where I thought we were going.
Yeah, right. I want to make sure that those new members on the behavioral health committee get the update, and then I think this is a big win for the. Well, it's you can consider it news, I guess, big news for the task force. So I do think that those members should be briefed as well.
So then you're saying presented on the 11th at the joint meeting and again on the 17th at the full task force?
Correct.
Yeah.
All right. Well, they're both on my calendar, so I can do that.
Thank you, everyone. Is there anything else that needs to be changed?
So there's one thing that we might want to add. I don't know if we want to talk about it here or on the GARE discussion. This morning at the PHAB meeting, we were talking about the racial equity work that they're doing, and we started talking about the Racial Equity Commission work that's going on. And it's, I had some conversations with Chuck and Health in between meetings, and we think it's valuable to invite all of the Incarceration Prevention Task Force members to a community visioning summit that's going to be on May 22nd. So I wonder if we want to bring that up during this meeting. We're going to send out invitations ahead of time, of course, but if it would be valuable to have it on this agenda as well.
Yes, definitely.
Okay, so we'll just stick that on, Jill.
Barry will present that.
Yeah.
Okay. Got it. Thank you.
Jill, this is Mike. I did see something missing. I thought we were going to at least talk briefly about racial and ethnic data.
Well, Mike, this is Jack, would that come under index maybe? Because I think
Sure.
when we had the index discussion, and I was going to bring that up with Stephen, I'm unclear, Stephen, were we recommending the broad index discussion be at the May meeting or the June meeting? Because that would inform this this discussion right now.
I was just looking at Jill's summary notes, and I don't see that clarified. Jill, do you recall?
But I don't think we decided. I think we were going to come to steering, explain the challenge, the opportunity, the circumstances, and then we would decide if that issue was a May agenda or June agenda. Okay. And if it's a May agenda, it's going to significantly affect this agenda.
Yes. Yeah. And if it's not a May agenda item, there's not much for the index committee to report, I think.
Nothing.
Yeah.
And Mike, and then the conversation about the racial equity would be deferred till the next meeting. So whenever we have the discussion about index, we can figure that out.
Okay, so are we wrapped up with this portion? Because I think the next item is that index committee discussion. That go ahead,
I
Ann.
have one. I guess I just want to register my thoughts, not quite concerns. But the other thing on the agenda is the Rising Strong program. And I realize that there are active conversations going on about maybe bringing some type of program like this to the county. I guess I'm feeling, I always get a little bit of nervous when we have a particular program presentation, because I think it implies that we somehow are prioritizing this. And at least when I look at the county behavioral health funds, we have a kind of a strategic plan, a continuum of care that we follow. And a lot of times something will come to the task force and then suddenly it becomes a big, important issue. And then we're getting pressure to fund it. And then it throws off our strategic plan. Not that this isn't an important program, but I just feel like sometimes it gets discombobulated as opposed to purposeful, strategic, sequential, that things just get thrown out there. So that's my only thought about this. I realize there's a lot of good things going on here, but I just sometimes feel like we lose control over our strategy and our timing when a particular program is brought forward, and it implies it's somehow rising to the top of all the other things we're considering.
I think you're really talking about priorities, and there's so much that we want to do and so much we need to do. And when that's true, we have to set priorities. We have to have one thing before the other. And you're saying, you know, the latest thing is glittering.
I'm saying that, not that it's glittering, I'm saying that everything must be looked at in the larger context, in the big picture, the strategic overall plan.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm saying here as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And you remind us of that pretty regularly. And thank you for that. I wouldn't read so much into this being on the agenda. This is a topic of conversation within at least part of the Behavioral Health Committee. And I might have chosen to have it more fully vetted in the committee, but I don't mind it burbling up to the task force as a whole as an informational item. But that's all I think it is that a discussion is going on about a particular program that targets a prevention service that, I think we'll have to demonstrate its relevance to the task force's mission. And then we'll have to have that discussion about where does it rank in the priorities. So I don't think the fact that it's there for discussion necessarily means there's a big push to leapfrog anything else. It means it's sort of asking the question of where would we slot this if we support it at all.
Yeah.
Dan, sorry, Dan, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, go ahead,
Dan,
Mike.
you also brought up a point about using a name of a program. And that kind of struck me a little bit, because obviously what we're really getting at is additional services for pregnant and parenting women, and fathers as well. But the largest kind of gap that we've been exposed to in the Behavioral Health Subcommittee has been that for pregnant and parenting women, for kind of residential-based treatment programs where they can keep custody of their children. Rising Strong is an example of addressing that. If that's changed at all to more the subject matter or the gap that we're addressing, and does that in some way change your concern at all?
I guess I just want to make sure that how we introduce it is couched in a big picture. And not even, I don't even know if I would say priorities or not. I mean, obviously, I can't argue against the priority of these kinds of programs. What I argue against is how does it fit into the big strategic plan? What is the timing? What is the funding? Is the funding entity driving it? All those things. It just has to be a really organized thing. And I think a lot of times there's rarely a bad program that comes forward. Rarely. And early on, and some of us weren't here very early on, but at the very beginning of the task force, these programs would come up and then everybody would say, yes, let's do it. And it's like, I feel like I was the bad person then, but I had to bring in, I just said, there is a model that we should use. I introduced the sequential intercept model. I said, how about if we plan, So that's just what I'm saying here. Obviously, pregnant and parenting women who are using drugs going to impact the future. We need to address it. That's a given. But that's the easy part. The tricky part is, where does it fit in the continuum? Where does it fit in the big picture of everything we're doing? How do we fund this relative to all the other great programs that are absolutely necessary? In what order? Who funds it? Just really complex stuff. So that's all I'm saying is we need to be really thoughtful when we present particular programs, that we introduce it as something to think about and to put into our strategic plan, and that we don't just automatically jump and say, it's a great idea, I think we vote on it. And especially if somebody in the task force says, I love it, I'm going to move that the county figure out how to fund this now, then suddenly it changes my work. Even though my committee says, you must be thoughtful, you must be, looking at the big picture. I know part of it is all about me and whining, but not only that, but I got more whining later in this meeting too, so I should portion that out.
Yeah, I want to jump in here as one of the guilty parties that is associated with the development of this program. I'm going to name my co-conspirator on this call, Mike Parker. He and I were asked by Byron Mannering, who's also a member of the task force, to just to kind of to help with the kind of an inquiry process into this program or type of program, to see if it had legs, and could we do it? And the funding part is really important. I don't want behavioral health dollars necessarily to go to this program at the expense of other existing good work that's being done currently. That being said, I think, and we've talked about this. We've talked about this in these weekly planning meetings that we've had with the PPW folks, and how to fund it outside of Whatcom County with state dollars and other sources of funding. So that's being really looked at seriously. A couple of things. One is I think we need to figure out when we have new to us programs, how we prioritize them, or if we prioritize them. I think that I don't really have a lot of clarity on that. And then the other piece is that Behavioral Health Committee has been very focused on upstream prevention, and other members of different committees have also been focused on upstream. I mean, we're talking about children's initiatives sometimes. That's my call at 1 o'clock, is to figure that one out. Does that have anything to do with the task force? I'd say, yeah, definitely. When we're looking at this PPW program, we're not only talking about treating the adult that is addicted and getting them the help that they need, but we're also talking about reducing ACEs for the children involved, including the unborn ones that are if the mom's pregnant. And we're also talking about family stability and a number of really good outcomes if we're successful in this program. Many of the folks that are involved in PPW programs in Evergreen down south in Snohomish and in Rising Strong in Spokane have our justice involved. And so to me, it is very germane that we talk about this. But it goes back to my previous question. What do we do when we come across these programs that speak to some of the priorities that we have identified over the course of years? How do we then bring them in and vet them and make sure that they don't come at the expense of the good current work? So I'm with you. I know I make it crazy sometimes when I bring up these programs, and I do want to do everything we can, but we can't. And you're right. You're absolutely 100% right. We need to prioritize, and we need to stick to the plan. The plan needs to drive the programs, not the other way around. I agree with you. I just want to find out a way to figure out a process to do that. That's all.
Jill?
Just as a reminder, when the task force originally created the sequential intercept and designated it as its strategic plan, you guys also developed a fairly in-depth form for proposed new programs to complete. I can email that form around to you guys as a reminder. It sounds like maybe it's time for this program to take a look at that form and try to fill it out to answer some of those questions. Is that something you'd like me to do?
I think that's a great idea, and thanks for reminding us of that, Jill. I'm on 12 or 13 different boards, commissions, or task forces, so I forget, some of the early work that's been done. So yes, I would greatly benefit from that as a member.
Stephen?
Yeah, I'd just like to ask Dan and Mike. I've had the pleasure of being part of those conversations on Rising Strong. I share Dan's hesitation about, or whoever said it, maybe Mike, naming a program, because I think it took a fairly short while before there was some consensus that Rising Strong, as it's consisted, is not really what's likely to roll out here, if anything. But I look around at the people on those calls, and there were 4 or 5 Bridget Collins staff people, and the 3 of us from the task force, Behavioral Health Committee, and Byron, who straddles the two. So I guess I would ask, do you think this shouldn't be in front of the Behavioral Health Committee as a whole for some further probing and question answering and data gathering and thinking before it even gets in front of the task force for whatever purpose we want?
Mike, you want to take that one?
Sure, Stephen, do you mean in addition to the discussions that we've already had, did those seem like they needed to be augmented or a little bit more purposeful or some consensus? Were you wanting to see something more formal? And I guess why I asked that is because obviously that's where the conversation first started. And then we agreed for some of us that were interested to take it out of that behavioral subcommittee, just an acknowledgement that it would dominate completely our agenda and all of that time. So is that what you were getting at? That something maybe a little bit more formal or?
Yeah, and I think when I think formal, I'm thinking, yeah, the committee didn't want it to dominate. So this side discussion was sort of set up to explore it further. I think it has started that process. But I would think it would come to the task force once it had a sort of a full-on deliberated recommendation from the committee. And I would think, just process-wise, it ought to go back there to see if it's fully baked in the committee's eyes and whether they want to put it in front of the task force. And some of the points that Ann quite rightly raises could be debated there even before the task force gets its hands on it. That was my thought.
Well, I think there's even a step before that. I think that there were other behavioral health committee members on several of the calls. Tank was on there. Chris Cochran, I believe, was on one of them. There's others I'm probably forgetting. And so I think there's a step before that, which could be if there are volunteers from the committee, if Mike and myself wanted to volunteer for this kind of separate group with the Bridget Collins folks and the other experts, then I think that's probably even more appropriate that we do that, then bring a more vetted model to the behavioral health committee for consideration, which could then go upstream to steering and then to the task force. Steering could make the decision, should we prioritize this in light of all the other things that we're doing? But I think there's even like that other step before, which I just consider myself a volunteer sort of outside the behavioral health committee on that development team for the PPW. So I don't know if that would make, Ann, would that make you feel any easier or easier?
Yeah. I just want to do everything on purpose.
Yeah.
And that we always keep our eye on the big picture and that we just don't pull ourselves off course, because there's just so many good things that we should be doing that we aren't.
Okay, so I would say then maybe that's the route that we go, where we can talk to Byron about maybe backing off the other committee members, especially the newer ones too, because I think then we send a signal like, this is how we do things. We just kind of chase after the latest shiny thing, and it's a really good thing, but at the expense of other programs. And I think Ann, you're right. I think that's probably the wrong message to send, especially to new members. That we are more purposeful. So I would then recommend that, perhaps Mike, if you're game, and I continue on this, we do have a conversation with Byron and just kind of make it more laser focused. We're not, I wouldn't say far along in development, but we've had several meetings, and I think now it's like a decision time. And to be quite frank, we're lacking an operator. And I think operator precedes funding. We have to have someone that says, yeah, we'll consider doing this as long as the funding is going to be there, and we don't have that yet. So that needs to happen. So I'm game to do it as a volunteer outside the purview of the task force or the behavioral health committee.
Jill?
So just to clarify, it sounds like we're taking this item off the agenda for the full task force, and then Dan and Mike, when you're ready, you can schedule it back on behavioral health committee. Is that correct?
Yeah, Mike, what do you think?
Just a couple of quick thoughts, and I know we're spending a decent amount of time on this, so I'll try to be as brief as possible. One, I don't think any of the folks on that call necessarily are feeling qualified to design, an intervention, and that's really appropriate for our role. I do think that one of the things that is appropriate for our role, though, is you use the term chasing new shiny. I think we were advised of a large gap of treatment options here for pregnant and parenting women. We were told it was between 20 and 30 women per year are not able to get the services that they need. And of course, Ann and everybody else in this calls knows what happens when we don't get those services. They're huge challenges in doing that. And at some point, engaging the broader task force, health department, people that are smarter than myself in terms of looking at, one, the gap, two, its relationship to incarceration reduction, which I believe is there and solid. And I thought it necessary at least to brief the task force that conversations are happening. But I really also hear very loud and clear with Ann that it needs to be contextualized so that it doesn't come out like, this is the priority, because I don't think that anybody has made that. We have not yet, gone to our behavioral health subcommittee members and asked them for their ranking, which we're going to do. So I guess I viewed Rising Strong as more of an FYI, that this is the issue of a gap in services for pregnant and parenting women to get treatment with their children in tow in Whatcom County in the North Sound region is a gap. There are some promising models, and we think analysis of that gap and possible models is good meat for the task force, and then it could engage other folks. So I guess the only disadvantage we have by not briefing larger task force is opening that up a little bit wider to get others in other functional areas get their expertise. I'm just very aware of my own limitations in this area. But other than that, Dan, I am fine with also taking it back. I do think there's a lot more kind of vetting work. We could put some more meat on the skeleton if we took it back. But I don't want to go too far down the road either, because then I think we would you go to what Ann brought up, where you're kind of like mentioning a program name already, right? So those are just my thoughts, but I am comfortable, Dan, if you do want to take that back to the committee, I am totally comfortable with that.
Yeah, I think it's better to be a little more cautious on this one in terms of order of operations and how we bring things forward in the future. I think it's a reset for us. Yeah, I'd be more comfortable if we had a more fully vetted idea, and when we do, then bring it forward. And I didn't mean to mischaracterize any or diminish anyone's addiction or situation by saying that we're chasing the shiny thing. It really just means, it speaks to what you just said, Mike. I'm not a clinician. I'm not qualified to develop a program. I'm there to help support the development of the program. And that's really what I meant by that. I don't mean to diminish any program that we would consider at all. But I do think that we need to pull back on this one and pull the reins in and then present it later when it's more vetted and ready.
Jack?
First, Stephen, sorry for interrupting you when I said I thought I was muted to my mother and I wasn't. On this topic, Jill, thank you so much for bringing the forum up. I was starting to think about it. You brought it up. The genesis of that was because there are so many good ideas, and Ann and others helped form the questions on that forum. My feeling is I don't want to see anything on the task force agenda until someone who would like the task force to review or understand it has taken the time to fill that out to the extent to which it can be filled out. It's possible not every question will be germane, particularly those things that fall in Intercept 0, which I believe this program would. Those are the ones, there's a whole separate set of questions, because the reality is, while some may not like the term bright, shiny object, and I can appreciate that because it sort of implies that we're not thoughtful, as Ann eloquently stated, there are so many worthwhile projects that when we get to Intercept 0, if we lose our focus too much, we won't get anything accomplished. And I don't want to speak badly about any of these programs, but one way to have the task force make thoughtful, informed decisions is to use that form at least as a template that comes to steering committee or for Stephen and I to ultimately make a decision on the agenda. And while I think there's lots of value in all the things that I've heard about gathering information and experience, it would be very easy to delude ourselves to the point of impotence. So I hope we Thank you for using the form. And Stephen, I hope we just sort of start mandating it in a polite way. Like, yeah, hey, this is the starting point, because it gets everyone thinking about it. And then when we're talking, we can look at those base points in that form, maybe adjust the form as it needs to be adjusted. We already did several times. I mean, Ann, I remember you added the criminogenic things for 0, I think, and those are helpful because it really helps keep our task force on our task force. Thanks.
Stephen.
Yeah, and I don't want to be understood as trying to push this outside the parameters of the task force. I'll just say two things. One model is the pretrial processes work group, where it was too big and not appropriate to consume the Legal and Justice Systems Committee, and yet it was called out explicitly by the Vera report, and so the committee and then the task force said, yeah, go ahead on the side on this important subject and explore it further and develop some recommendations. I don't see why the Behavioral Health Committee or the task force itself couldn't authorize that kind of exploration. I think maybe I disagree with you a bit, Dan, on this. I think it's still in very early stages of the thought process. So I think there would be a fair bit of work that you'd still want to do to make a compelling case for this, at least in the task force context of prevention and reduction of incarceration, not in the behavioral health planning scheme for services valuable to the community. I think it's, I've been on the calls because I think they're worthwhile calls. I think that's a significant unmet need. I think it's likely that it has incarceration implications. I just think there's a lot more work to be done on it. I think it's perfectly appropriate for the committee to be reporting that these conversations are going on. Here's where they started, here's what we've done, here's where we think we're going in the next couple months, and we'll keep you updated. So in terms of Mike's framing of it as an FYI item, I think it's completely appropriate for it to be reported to the task force.
Dan?
Okay, so following your logic then, when we have an item like this where we, like Mike was saying, we identify a gap, and to me, it's like the task force is sort of the repository of all things criminal justice and criminal justice reform, or should be. Members should know where the gaps are, where the successes are. So when we know about a gap and we know about a possibility then, and we don't necessarily want to bring it forward as a program for endorsement or for any recommendation or anything like that, then does that then fall short of the form that Jill, you were talking about before? I mean, how do we do that part when we want to let members know, because we want them to be informed. And in some cases, like Mike was saying before, they could potentially help us out or identify a resource, or maybe they themselves are a resource and we just didn't know it. What is the process for the FYI versus the, hey, we want to consider this program? Because to me, those are two separate items. They're two separate paths. So I could use some help here on that one.
My recollection of the conversation all those years ago now was that the purpose of the form was to bring a new program, first of all, to the steering committee for their review, and then passing that then on to the full task force, and to let you guys decide whether or not this is something you want to spend task force time on. I don't know if that helps to answer your question, Dan, but I think the intent of the form was just to say, yeah, we're going to spend time on this, or no, you need to do more work on your program, and then the task force will.
But Jill, can I add on to that? Because Jill and I were involved in this. It was also meant to be a filter. We were being assaulted with far more demands for task force time than we humanly could do it. I remember conversations with Ann, Ken, others, and that's why we used the form as a filter, because we had a few task force members that wanted really the entire agenda of every task force meeting. And so we tried to have a transparent, equitable resource to rely on to inform our agendas. And that's also in part the steering committee, because we couldn't handle the requests and we didn't want to seem like we were always favoring the prosecutor or the sheriff over the consumer advocate. So we needed some sort of external reference to accommodate that. That would be my memory of the genesis of this.
Dan, is that a new hand or you're?
Oh, you'd think that after like 11 or 12 months of using Zoom, I'd figure out how to lower my hand. Sorry about that, Barry.
Oh, it's okay. Don't worry about it. You're not the only one, believe me.
Terrible.
Anything else on the agenda?
So just to ask, because I'm still not clear, we're keeping this item on the task force agenda or not?
Stephen?
Ultimately it's up to Stephen and Jack as co-chairs whether or not the pregnant.
My sense is everybody's okay at least delaying it for now. Does anybody object to that? Okay, and then Stephen, are you in agreement? Let's ask. It's our failure for not asking people. The task force has been running so well, we haven't really needed the form, but I think this is a good example of why to have it. And I do think there's a lot of worthwhile things in this program that you're bringing up, but let's just, when you're ready for the task force to review it, fill it out to the best of your ability. We'll bring it to steering committee and likely it'll become a topic.
Yeah, I'm in agreement with what Jack and Jill both said. I'll just go back to what I said. I think this is a rich topic to be reporting out of the Behavioral Health Committee, that these discussions are going on and you'll hear more about them. This is an identified gap. It's very much like Arlene would say, Legal and Justice has identified a gap in reentry programs. We don't have a program yet. We're not filling out a form because we don't have anything concrete to analyze, but we are talking about it. And that's something that the task force ought to know about. I think this is sort of a parallel situation in that regard.
So what you're suggesting then, Stephen, is just a line item in the Behavioral Health Committee subcommittee report out, right? Yeah, that makes sense.
Barry, I want to quickly clarify the record. The Jill I referred to with the filter was Jill Bernstein, not Jill Nixon.
Oh, okay.
Just so everybody knows. Yeah, it's not all, but yeah, so just to be clear.
Y'all, I've got to take off to go to that doctor's appointment. Thanks for the discussion this morning.
Take care, Dan. We'll see you at 1 o'clock.
Thanks, Dan.
See ya.
Okay, so are we wrapped up on that item? So let's move to the index committee. Jack and Stephen and Jill had a meeting. Yeah, go ahead, Stephen.
I just wanted to say back on the task force agenda, I don't know what Jack thinks, and I'd be interested in Jill's thoughts also. You were about to lead into this, but it seems to me that the index discussion, both the reporting and where this might go, warrants something more than just being in the committee reports. It might be its own item. It's information and that's all, but it heads off in a pretty important direction, I think. So I don't know what Jack, you think about breaking that out as a separate report that Caleb might make, or we all might make on that conversation.
Well, Stephen, my memory is we suggested it be the bulk of a task force meeting.
We did suggest it would be a bulk of a task force meeting, but I'm talking about providing the background for why we're making that suggestion. So I don't think we're prepared to do that for the May 17th meeting. I think we do want to tee that up for the June meeting, but I think the task force deserves an explanation for why we would devote that much attention to it.
Okay, well, I think I think this is the discussion we're in then about when we're doing this and why we're doing this. I would think then that for index, if we're not doing it in May, in May, if we're not doing the full discussion in May, we can have a brief foreshadowing of what will happen in June. And that probably rightfully comes from you and I more than Caleb. I think that'd be his preference. So I think, my hope right now is we just bring everybody up to speed on the meeting you and I and Barry had, determine if we're going to have this discussion in May or June, and then that should hopefully address this topic.
Okay, fair enough.
Just so you're aware, though, the index committee doesn't meet in June, so there aren't going to be any more conversations that I'm aware of. I mean, there could be on this issue, though, before the June meeting. So what we talked about last week is there's not going to be any more information to add to that unless there's something another discussion going on that you guys want to have.
Well, I think, Jill, I think Stephen's just saying if we don't talk about it in May, tell the task force in May why we're going to talk about it in June. Is that correct?
Okay. So you just want to give the task force a heads up about the conversation in June and schedule index in June.
Because
if that's what we decide, I think that's what we're going to decide right now.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. That'll probably be the output of this next agenda
Right.
item. So let's
sorry
move
to get us off track.
Oh, that's okay, Stephen. You're on the right track. So we Jack and Stephen called a meeting. Myself and those two and Jill Nixon. We met. I only could stay for about 15 minutes because I had another appointment. But I'm going to let the co-chairs report out on what transpired. Caleb was there as well, Caleb Erickson. So maybe you can give us a rundown of that.
Jack, you want to take a whack
Sure,
at that?
and I'll have to leave after this. So, and Barry, before I leave, I want to have 2 minutes to give. This is off topic, but on the annual report, I wanted to basically weigh in support of Ann's comments. I want to make sure I'm on the record for that. But on the index meeting, the meeting was held because of some challenges with Lieutenant Erickson's ability now to respond or provide, I would say, and obtain from different stakeholders data that would be useful to the task force. And without taking 10 minutes to explain all the reasons why, Jill's got an excellent report that talks about some of the challenges. What seemed the most helpful solution, now that the sheriff's office has made much of what's called the Spillman data available, which answered many of the initial questions, there are still data needs coming from the task force, or we might call them data desires. Some are desires more than needs, but what would be useful for making informed decisions. And Lieutenant Erickson has some challenges in getting those. Those challenges are a combination of probably the time it takes to gather it, the fact that some records are on paper, the reality that this may not be a priority for some of the stakeholders, and so forth. So we thought an appropriate way to raise awareness of the challenge, both for the stakeholders that might be able to provide information potentially, as well as those individuals and committees that want information, is to just have a discussion where he can come in and explain where he's at, what he's been able to accomplish, and what the barriers or challenges are. And then we could have a discussion within the task force that hopefully would result in potentially getting some more information, as well as creating a realistic expectation of what information is reasonable to expect. Stephen, does that about capture it?
Yeah, and the comments I would add to what Jack said, which was a really good summary, is a number of the stakeholders have taken steps already, really locked into place, movement toward new data systems for their agencies. What hasn't been given much thought is the ability to coordinate data across systems still, which was one of the primary goals of the task force and the index committee at its outset. So there was some thought that there are consultants available, IT consultants, who could help the agencies analyze and look at solutions to that exchange part of the index charge. And so the value of that and how to go about that with an RFQ and qualifications and so forth might be things that we want to talk about. And I guess what I took out of that was whether there maybe need to be a refresh done on the charge that the task force gives to the index committee. I think there was some sense, and it was well hidden in Jack's remarks, that we may not any longer have the right people in that conversation, or maybe those people have carried the conversation as far as they can in an IT context, and now we're up at a more of a policy level kind of coordination that the task force would be back to playing a primary role for. Does that seem accurate, Jack?
Yeah, in the last comment as you were talking, I forgot to mention that may be important. There was talk of bringing in a consultant that's familiar with this challenge of gathering criminal justice data within a community, because it's a common challenge. So I did reach out to Vera to ask what experience they had, because what they told us when they were interviewing us is the accumulation of data and the segregation of databases that would be useful is common everywhere. So they have not responded, which leads me to think Liz may not be working there anymore, but I'll reach out to someone else. And we don't have any recommendations yet as to what would be a logical and efficient path of improving that. But we and I think Lieutenant Erickson hope to have some of that information when the task force discusses this. So, and I'm guessing, Stephen, from our conversation, you're thinking we do this in June, and then in May, just kind of tell the task force it's going to come up in June. And we probably have I'm guessing a 45-minute discussion on this ish.
Yeah, I think that sounds like a good ballpark. The other thing I'll report from this conversation that we're summarizing here is the other thread of the conversation was, although all of the committees have asked for data, identified data needs or desires, as Jack says, and we have also committed ourselves to implementing the racial equity toolkit, one of the linchpins of which is making race-conscious decisions based on data. There's a fair bit of urgency and desire for people to get data to work with, and we have yet to get any reports of data from index committee. So I was urging us to figure out a way that we could have a dashboard or some sort of access to what data the index agencies have identified and would be available for us to work with within the task force. And so that might be something that we include in the conversation as a whole.
Okay. Sounds like we have a plan then. I do see the index committee itself isn't meeting until July now, right, Joe?
They're not going to meet until after this discussion.
Yeah,
He doesn't think it's, yeah.
That totally
And
makes sense.
I will just say that I know this is on the record. Caleb questioned whether or not they were in a point where they were able to have constructive conversations anymore, whether they were really moving forward effectively at this point. So I think that's part of why their meetings have become more sporadic, because there's not much business being conducted. Barry, I see Mike's hand up.
Oh, yeah. Go ahead, Mike.
Thank you. Stephen, thanks for mentioning that. You kind of took the piece that I was going to bring up, is that, if it weren't for Wendy Jones really kind of notifying the task force about changes to data collection methods, we wouldn't have known of that gap. And so without our experts sharing their data with what they have, we kind of don't know what the issues were. I'm also with you, Stephen, that we haven't had much data really coming into the committee as late. And this is just my impression, and I may have missed presentations that contained rich data that I missed. Just to underscore what Stephen said, challenges with data are frequently reasons to not move forward. And I think we need to acknowledge those challenges, and I certainly respect, and boy, do I appreciate the work that Index has done so far and all the members and the agencies, because we wouldn't have made the progress that we do. And I just want to, one, stop and say that appreciation. And two, then think about if it sounds like index in its relation in the task force or its repository of requests, and I'm trying to understand the subtext that was given to me a few minutes ago, and I think I'm kind of getting it. But as a behavioral health subcommittee co-chair, I have to say on the record, it's absolutely critical for the work of the task force that we understand the demographics of everyone through criminal justice systems, through behavioral health systems, to the extent possible. And I just want to state that on the record, and I appreciate the good work that everybody does. My bringing that up is not a fault, is not a slam, and is not an indictment upon anybody or on any system. It is a value, it's an expression of hope. And I think in order to move forward for our community, especially those that have experienced historical marginalization, they need to see that we care about it. They need to see that we go on record and say that we value it. So I understand that there may be different ways that we get that. It may be a long, arduous road. It may involve system creation or coordination. But I feel it very important that I go on the record and say how important that is. We know that there are gaps on what we're tracking right now. That probably means that there are more. And I believe it behooves us as committee members to do what we can to support the closure of those gaps and to support the data coming in that is germane to the work of the task force. Not that's just as interesting. And I think Jack brought up that distinction. That's really important too. We don't want to just make a ton of requests just because I'm curious. It really should be very germane to something really critical. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. Thank you for the update on index, guys. I found that very, very informative, and I appreciate it.
Okay,
Irving,
Jack?
do you mind if I go next, because I have to sign off?
Yeah, go ahead.
I got 3 people standing here waiting to head to this funeral, so I apologize. Thank you. Hopefully we can have this conversation in June. Mike, you've articulated the values of why Index was created in the first place. Thank you for that. And on the next topic, I want to say I did read Ann's comments, and I was when I say basically in support of Amanda, the only reason I say basically, I'm just assuming that the ones where you're challenging data will find the answers, and I absolutely agree. Let's make sure that the comments we make are accurate, and let's not let the tail wag the dog and have programs inform a strategic plan. I like that quite a bit. So, and Jill, the report's looking great. So sorry to derail this a little, but I wanted to get that on the record. And I'm sorry I have to go, and see you all soon.
Okay, Jack, take care.
Thanks. Okay, bye.
Safe travels home
Thank you. Tomorrow.
Okay. Okay, Arlene?
I have a question, because it came up while I was trying to do some research on domestic violence, and that was that there are nationwide statistics available. And I wonder if our index committee ever, my cat.
Was that your cat? I thought something fell off the wall.
If the index committee ever refers to national statistics in trying to answer questions as, as a help.
No.
No.
The index committee, they're not the data analysts, they're not statisticians, so they really don't have the background to do a lot of the answering of these data questions that are being asked of them. But no, I can say I don't recall them ever having discussed national trends or statistics.
Mm-hmm. Because it's not, there's no guarantee that it would match local situation, but at least it could give you some, some basis for thinking about problems and solving them. It's just a thought.
Anything else on the index committee? Okay, we'll move to the annual report.
So there's a lot of today's agenda, so I'm just going to buzz through this pretty quickly. I want to start with the version of the report that Jackie sent with Jackie and Ann's comments, and this is the one with the supplemental that I sent yesterday, not the full report. I've already talked to Ann, and most of these changes that she and Jackie have suggested, I'm totally fine with, and I can do those, and I'll work with her offline. There's a couple of things that do need committee discussion. And I just want to clarify for you guys also this section right here. I let Ann know that this is not regarding the Behavioral Health Advisory Committee. It's regarding that collaboration between legal and justice and behavioral health committees. So, and given that information, does that change? Is that okay with you, how the original language?
I'll double check with Jackie, and I don't know if Jackie can weigh in here. I guess all I want to make sure that we understand is that the Behavioral Health Advisory Committees, which is a county committee separate from the task force, does oversee quite a few local dollars that provide some of these services already. So I just want to make sure we understand there is a connection, but I understood what you were saying, that when I initially thought you were talking about that committee, you were actually talking about the Behavioral Health Committee of the task force.
Yeah. I think the big question, oh, here we go. Funding for domestic violence offender treatment. I'm working with Bruce Van Glept on that program and that information for the report there. So a lot of this is going to change. I haven't gotten his information quite yet, but so I'll work with you when I get that from Bruce, and we can refine that language.
And I would love to talk about this for just a moment with the steering committee. And I know Raylene isn't here, and this is really important to her. So, but with that said, first of all, we worked really, really carefully with district court on this program, and Perry basically set up the program with district court because Perry has, a clinical background. We, clinically speaking, the program that the state has outlined for treatment for offenders, it is concerning to me. I think that they set it up because insurance companies don't pay for it, and so they kind of backed into the minimal amount of contact to try to make sure that at least there's some standards and expectations in the treatment protocol. But I guess I just want to say to this group, I'm concerned about local government dollars funding this program. I think this is a very, very high risk program in that this population we're serving is high risk. I think the treatment protocols set by the state are barely adequate to treat people effectively. And I'm talking as a clinician here, but I'm also talking from the standpoint of trying to protect the county's interests. And I know there's really a push to expand this program, but I have grave concerns about that if it's expanded with local government dollars. So I just want to throw that out. It's a difficult conversation, but.
So in terms of this report, and when I get the information from Bruce that's specific to his program, would you want to write a small paragraph expressing your concerns to include in the report?
Well, I think I don't know that we're there yet. I mean, I'm representing myself and looking out for the best interests of the county, but I don't know that the task force has really addressed this. So I can't speak for the task force. That's why I'm bringing it up at the steering committee here. It just keeps coming up as we need to do more. I'm concerned. We right now use some behavioral health dollars, which are local government dollars, to support what treatment is being done. And it's a little scary.
And the problem is that we don't have a complete treatment system without treating the offenders. They have to be treated, otherwise the system isn't complete if we're only treating the victims. And the information that I wrote here came from the directors of the various agencies in our local community. This is what they told me. It's not my personal knowledge. But I do feel that there is risk, of course, in dealing with the offenders. There always is. The other piece of this puzzle, which is terribly important, I think, is the idea that most domestic violence is not reported. That's what they told me. And that was something that I didn't really fully understand. So it's terribly important to reach as many people as possible to make it comfortable for the public to report their cases. The other thing they said that was terribly important, I think, too, was that they're not interested in using the justice system as a way of healing and restoring justice for domestic violence. Both the victims and the treaters are saying that. So there's a lot of change implied in all of this, but I don't quite understand the reluctance to use local money, and I don't quite understand it. What you're saying.
My concern is that the treatment modality that the state has outlined as basic requirements is insufficient to create change in the offender.
Oh, okay.
And we are, by supporting it with our funds, are providing a promise to the community that these treatment efforts make a difference. Those are my concerns. And I don't want to disparage the two providers that we have doing this work. I just think I think the treatment is lacking, not just in terms of the number of people that are able to provide it. It's the actual modality itself.
Stephen?
It's very, I'm going to go back to what I said about Rising Strong. I think this is something that has been discussed a little bit in Legal and Justice, where I go to all the meetings, but I don't think there is a decision or anything on this. I think this is an area that is being explored. And I certainly think your concerns are valid. So it's part of the exploration to factor those things in. You're reluctant to criticize the current providers, but almost no one else is. I think it was a very strong consensus from everybody that Arlene's group talked to that the treatment that had been being provided was not satisfactory, and the state rules were a significant upgrade clinically. So I'm interested in the fact that they still may not be adequate. But this apparently is a really, really complicated situation, because the fact of the matter is all of the judicial officers want to impose this as a condition in these cases, and they do. What they're imposing is really inadequate treatment. What we're trying to explore is how we can upgrade that. The question of county dollars or not, I think, is a factor, but for the task force, maybe not entirely a determinative factor yet. So I think this should be framed as a complicated situation where there's high need but high complexity and lots of avenues yet to be explored. And that's all, because I think that's the only place that the committee is at with this. I think it's just reporting that this is a topic of consideration in the Legal and Justice Subcommittee.
Jill?
All right. I lose my ability to raise my hand when I'm sharing my screen.
I can see you.
Stephen, thank you for saying that. I have a suggestion. What if we really reduce the content of this section quite a bit, and keeping in mind that this is under the heading of next steps for the Legal and Justice Committee. And like you said, Stephen, just really frame, here's the program, and the Legal and Justice Committee wants to explore this program further. Is it worth expanding? And just come at it from, that perspective, Stephen, that you mentioned. Is that something, Anne and Arlene, that would be a good compromise for the two of you? And I can craft some draft language and send it around to you later, and we can work on that together. How does that sound?
It works for me, Jill, and I really appreciate you offering that. We're all aware that this is a very serious situation in our community, actually throughout the nation, and that insurance doesn't cover this service, and therefore, rarely anybody can afford it. So I think there are complex issues that we really need to look at very seriously. And it's gonna, as Steve said, there's just many moving parts here.
Arlene?
Anything else on the report?
If I could just jump in with one more comment on the domestic violence part, I'll just remind people that when Karen Burke was at DV-SAS and they were developing this pilot program with the new state requirements, they presented that to Legal and Justice. We recommended it. The task force endorsed it. So I'm gathering that we did not have complete information, that we didn't loop in the clinical part of that and Anne's assessment of that. So I think that counsels for a really cautious, more thorough approach as we go forward with this. Not that it's less important, but that we need to make sure that all the pieces are being fit together. I think we still need to address it if we can. And I think I think Jill's suggestion that as a next step, we condense this quite a bit and frame it as more of an exploration than anything else is a good approach.
I really appreciate that, Stephen. When that kind of went through the task force, it was really, really difficult for me and for the clinical people in my office as well. And that we knew the state program had created new standards, and we knew that they were not adequate to truly change the behavior of offender. So it was very difficult. And then we were commanded to fund it, which again made me very uncomfortable because it put the county in a very difficult situation. And I believe that Perry and Bruce have done fabulous work on protecting the county and holding people accountable to the greatest extent possible in terms of treatment regimen. But
so I will listen to this conversation after the meeting and rewrite this section to include some of these concerns, just mention them briefly, and connect with you and Anne and Arlene to get some more feedback on them. Moving to the main section of the report, do you guys want to go page by page, or do you just have specific things that you want to mention to me? How do you want to do this, Barry?
Why don't you just go page by page?
First page, introduction and executive summary. Has everyone read this or at least skimmed it already?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So does anyone have any concerns about this here? Page 1? No. Page 2, we're still in the headlines section of the executive summary for each of the committee. Pretrial diversion, behavioral health. Page 3, stop me if you have comments. And then moving into the programs and initiatives for the task force as a whole, the introduction, a lot of this was taken from the last report that Mark Gardner wrote. So thank you to him for helping out here. Overview of task force activities. Now, Ann noted here, I don't know if this is something you guys want to talk about here in this committee. It's something I think that Ann and I can maybe reword a little bit. Does anyone want to talk about these suggestions? No? Crisis Stabilization Center opening, any comments? No? COVID impacts to the Whatcom County Jail. I took this information from some comments Bill Elfo made to Legal and Justice Committee. Municipal and district and Superior Court. I'm still working on some of these impacts. I'm going to hopefully get some more information from Bruce today. And anything on this one? Bellingham Municipal Court and electronic home monitoring. Race and drug court impacts. And I don't know if I heard this somewhere, if I made it up. So when you find out, let me know. It's in the back of my brain as something I heard, so maybe that's where I pulled it, but I just couldn't tell you right off the top of my head.
Yeah, and we were going to divert them and then we barely did. So
Maybe-
I'll work with you on getting correct information.
Okay. Racial equity in the criminal justice system. This section really, thank you, Mark Gardner, if he's listening. A lot of this came from him. Task force in transition. Probably we don't need to talk about it today, but I'm going to need some examples of other community efforts that have been influenced by the task force, and the same with new partnerships. If I can just have, 2 or 3 examples of each that you guys can think of, email me, that would be really helpful. Anything on this section?
I can give you one example, Jill.
Okay, thank you. Next section, funding for incarceration and prevention and reduction programs. I'm thinking about maybe not even including this section, or just going extremely high level, as in, here are some of the funding sources, just real general. And then for one paragraph 2, in addition to HB 1590, any other potential new funding sources that may be coming into the county. And then paragraph 3, potential use of COVID funds, which is something that I think was at this committee or discussed with Tyler Schroeder. Do you guys have thoughts?
I kind of like your idea, Jill, of maybe very high level and maybe just one paragraph, which is that there are a number of sources that fund various programs. And even if I think of some of the programs we're funding now with our local behavioral health funds, we pull in anything we can, federal, state, whatever. So even our programs have more than one funding source. So I guess I feel more comfortable having a very general one paragraph on this one. And I'm happy to write something if you'd like. Okay.
Yeah, very general is what is about as far as my capability goes on this topic. So if you guys want to get any more detailed, I'm really gonna would have to rely on you to provide some of that content. Data, it's pretty general narrative there. Any questions or comments? Communication strategy and public awareness. We talked about that on the other handout that we just looked at. The same with housing. Any comments on those sections? Next steps for the task force. Crisis response expansion program. limiting cash bail. This came from Jack. And then committee reports, introduction on just the committees themselves, legal and justice, an intro on legal and justice, some of the things they've been working on, including lead. The bulk of this came from Eric Ritchie. Pretrial processes, this came from Stephen and the judges. Stop me if there's anything you want to talk about. Now, this one, Bellingham Municipal Court, this is what Darlene submitted. This information is not just pretrial, so I'm not quite sure how to, whether we should retitle this section or whether I should just ask Darlene to give us pretrial specific information. If you have a preference on how to handle that, please let me know. Small cities municipal courts, I still need to get that from Raylene. Next step for Legal and Justice Systems Committee, I believe we've already talked about that, and the same with DV offender treatment. So progress report, Behavioral Health Committee. This is also, thank you to Mark Gardner. Improvements, Grace, and lead. And I'm going to change this right here to be consistent with the lead narrative that Eric wrote. And I think they referenced a multi-jurisdictional group of contributors. So that language is consistent throughout the report. Shelter plus care vouchers, funding for housing and behavioral health facilities and services, SUD treatment, new alternative. Yeah.
Back when you were looking for examples of influences of the task force in other areas,
Yes.
and I offered an example, I was thinking of this discussion on use of shelter plus care vouchers, which is again one of these side conversations that have cropped up with mostly people who are not part of the task force. So I don't know necessarily whether we want to sort of take quote unquote credit for it as progress of the Behavioral Health Committee necessarily, rather than, you know, it aligns with Behavioral Health Committee and task force as a whole, and it wouldn't be happening without you know, without that impetus and involvement, but it is sort of a separate discussion. I don't know, Mike, what do you think?
Stephen, I was just going to say, I think you've stated that really well. It is really kind of more broad. And while obviously it's for folks with behavioral health disorders, it is not specifically exclusively germane to behavioral health at all. And I think its placement in the report under new partnerships might make more sense.
Great, thank you. I will move that.
Thanks, Mike.
Jill, I'm guilty. I did have to step away briefly. I have I copied Anne, and I've done some comments, and I must admit I did miss part of your earlier. Can I just send you that document with comments, and then if they're useful to you, then you can employ them, and if not, or they're already done, you can discard them? Okay. I do have some on some of the sections that you've been on. There's nothing huge. I thought this looked really good, but I just wanted to say that I have that, and I'll send that to you at the completion of the meeting.
That would be fantastic. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. And thank you, by the way, for incorporating the language. I'm glad that the language made sense to move out. And I'm talking specifically about the racial equity language, that it doesn't just live in behavioral health, because that's maybe where it started. But much like Stephen's saying, it doesn't live only there, and it's really much more broad than that. So thank you for that.
Right. I felt Mark did such a good job with that, his original report. I felt a little bad cutting it up and placing it in different places in here in the big report. Progress report, Behavioral Health Committee, just the introduction. Oh, here we go. Okay, so Shelter Plus Care is where we left off. Expansion of funding for housing, behavioral health facilities and services. SUD treatment, new alternative crisis response capacity. Advancing racial equity and justice. And because the Behavioral Health Committee has really talked about this a lot, I did go ahead and leave in a lot of what Mark wrote about that was committee specific regarding GARE.
Bill, can I just go back a second?
Yes.
Back in progress for Behavioral Health Committee. Again, the Acadia Health Services SUD treatment, I wouldn't really see that as progress in the Behavioral Health Committee. You know, it's obviously a related thing and it's beneficial to the task force goals, but it seems like an odd duck in that kind of description. And again, I defer to Mike and to Ann as well on their thoughts there.
Stephen, thank you for bringing that up. I was going to question that, and maybe I'm questioning my memory. So I do have a 13-month-old and I am guilty of not remembering everything. I actually can't recall this or feel a sense of ownership of that coming from the behavioral health subcommittee, but Jill maybe has a much better memory than I do, and maybe that was. But I would say if it lives in this report at all, it certainly would not have to live in this area. That's just my thought. And Anne, I'm open to what you think.
I don't recall the committee really discussing this, especially within the past year at all. So I'm happy to just remove it from the report entirely.
I recall Ann making a report of this. It is a significant development for community services.
I think I need, I was also pulled away very briefly, but specifically what is our concern?
Maybe it lives in another area of the report. And is it still a going current concern? Just because it hasn't been brought up recently. So we wanted to make sure that that's still kind of.
Let me talk with my staff and get back to you.
Okay.
My concern was thinking of Jack and I presenting to the county council and then saying, well, tell us more about what the Behavioral Health Committee did for this Acadia Health Services expansion. And there's nothing to say there as far as I'm aware.
It is an independent process that we didn't have a part in other than being notified. And that, you know, sometimes new programs coming into town connect with us to figure out, you know, what they need to do, how they need to communicate the new services, but it isn't a direct connection to anything the task force has done. It really is just a comment of something that's come into the community or that is coming in.
Would you like me to continue?
It's
Okay. Behavioral Health Committee representation. Issues and opportunities, priorities and next steps for Behavioral Health Committee. Any comments or concerns there? Crisis Stabilization Facility Committee. This is all from Anne. Thank you very much. Any questions, concerns, comments there? No? And operational funding, quality assurance, index committee. Now this is all from, mostly from Caleb. First paragraph is pulled from a previous report and slightly edited and updated. Is there anything, any questions or concerns about this right here? From Index?
Jill, I haven't really tried to integrate in my mind our discussion and coming discussions about Index with what's reported here. Do you think they fit well enough?
I do.
Okay,
I think Caleb did a really, really good job with his section of the report here, following that conversation.
thank you.
So do you have any questions, concerns, or comments about the format and the organization of the report? Anything, or thumbs up? Excellent. Anything else? Do I need to be redirected into a different direction with something? Any other thoughts, comments?
Just really, really impressive, Jill.
Yeah, it looks great.
Thank you.
Could we consider an Academy Award for ability to think, organize, and retain knowledge and information beyond all of us?
Arlene, that is why I record meetings. I don't retain anything.
I want to see Jill in a designer gown.
No.
Jill's going to put that comment on as a ringtone.
Maybe we should get her a hat that says, "I heard cats well."
Really?
I can do that.
No,
That's
I only
fine.
had one last thing. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Oh, just the one last thing about the Acadia. And it looks like it's open, and they're calling it the Bellingham Comprehensive Treatment Center Opioid Use Disorder Program.
Oh,
So as far as I can tell, it has become a going concern, and they have a specific name for their Bellingham operations on Northwest Avenue. So if it lives in the report, maybe we could add that piece in there.
yeah, I think I'd feel more comfortable removing it from the report as I think about this. We had nothing to do with it other than what the county typically does when these new programs come in, but it really wasn't related to the task force. I also think in terms of workforce shortages, our substance use disorder treatment programs are in much better shape than our mental health programs.
Is that it for the report, Jill?
That's it from me. I just want to give a real quick shout out to Mark Gardner, who, like I said, contributed a lot of this, and to everyone who contributed content, got it to me on time. I really appreciate it. It was super helpful. So thank you.
So folks, we are at time and we still have 4 more agenda items. So I don't know what you want to do with this. I know I have a meeting I have to get to at 1, and I was hoping to go make a sandwich, but I don't know. What do y'all want to do?
I
I
can't
want to
stay longer.
ask just briefly, if we have time at the task force meeting, can we show the link to the county website that Jed Holmes put together on the Crisis Stabilization Center? I just think it's a feel good, and I'd love to do that. And I'm fine with, deferring to the next time, Barry. I think getting a sandwich is good self-care.
Yeah, and I have to talk to Jill just for a couple of seconds, if you could hang around after the meeting, just
Sure.
for 2 minutes.
And I'm wondering, do you want to share that link with the full task force? I can play it during the meeting. Do you want to do that under committee reports?
Yes, that'd be great.
Okay,
Thank you very much.
sure, no problem.
Then I
Jill,
guess
when are we scheduled to meet next? June
14th. Oh, no.
June 3rd.
3rd, yeah, the 3rd.
I was just thinking, since we're carrying over so many items, did we want to schedule a meeting as soon as possible? But that's probably soon enough.
That's what, 3 weeks, right?
So we can carry over these items to the next meeting. Yeah. Okay.
All right, thank you all.
I think so.
We're adjourned. Jill, I'll just talk to you just for a second.
Sure, give me just a second. So.